This title, Stewarding Privilege, Living According to the Kingdom of God While Navigating the Disparity of Social Structures, is a bit of a mouthful, you have to say, as to what do you pull out of that. And so in thinking about how to approach it, it seemed to me that the best way to approach it is in reverse. And so what I'd like to do this morning is to talk with you about social structures, and then say something about disparity, and then living in accordance with the kingdom of God in that reality, and finally on the stewarding of privilege, and so bring it to that. So that's the title, but we're going to go at it backwards, and I hope that you will agree that that's a workable way to take on this kind of multifaceted set of words and ideas here. And the thing that I want to begin by pointing out and acknowledging is that social structures are a necessity. We need social structures. We need to do that. There are 8 billion people in this world, and while God might know them all individually, you and I cannot. And so we need boxes, we need categories of thought to put these people in, and that's what we do. And the term for that, if I can, Tiffany, okay, well, that's all right, I'll just do it without him. Okay.
If you give it to me, I'll just.
Okay, all right, I'll tell you to change it. Okay. Change it. It ought to say, there we go. All right. The term for that, the fact that we have to recognize people by certain categories, is called intersectionality. And I think I wanted you to tell you that because I wanted you to go home with a snob word to tell to other people that, well, what did you learn? Well, we talked about intersectionality, and there you are. And so you can make everybody feel bad for not being here by your erudite position. Intersectionality is the concept that refers to the fact that people simultaneously recognized by and classified and interacted with on the basis of various social characteristics, race, gender, sexuality, ability, class, nationality, and so on. Okay, that's what we do. Now, that's how we look at people. So, who's that over there? Well, that's a woman. Okay, that's a woman. This is a man. Those are categories of thought for us. That's how we do it. Now, we have a necessity to kind of put people in these categories, to interpret them. We can't do otherwise. But that necessity exposes us to what G.K. Chesterton called the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the church, which is original sin. The only thing that's the truth of the church that's obvious is original sin, the consistent human tendency to make a mess out of things. And so the way, I think there's somebody talking about original sin later on, but they'll probably do better than that. But that's what it amounts to. It's our capacity to make a mess out of things. And we experience original sin in this case when we recognize people by categories. What we do next is that we assign values to those categories. That women are like this, and black people are like this, and white people are like that, and rich people are like this. And we assign values to the people who are there. And so those values are coordinated with the societal disparities in races. Okay, so in races, genders, sexualities, abilities, social class, and nationality. So that leads to what is in fact the full definition of intersectionality. So if you give me another slide, which is that it's the way we recognize people in all these things, but it's created overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and disadvantage. And that means we assigned values to it. And we said, oh, this is a Hispanic person, this is a gay person, and we start assigning values, and we create the disparities that go with it, which is another part of our title and our subject. So that's one way of understanding how we get to disparities in social structures. We understand people to be in categories, and then we assign values to those categories. There are a number of examples of that. Gender is one, wealth is one, all kinds of things. But probably the one we talk about the most is race. And people, all people, have taken comfort from the notion of the timelessness of what we believe in life. So that the things that I believe, I think, have always been true. Now, you probably not, but me, I know that what I believe, what I accept as a given, is part of the timelessness of creation. And so we have, in this thing about intersectionality, the social structures, for example, of aristocracy. And so we can say, well, that's just the way it is. That there's the Duke and the Earl, and there's the serf, and that's the way it works. That's the created order. Tribal cultures, the American Indians, Judaism for most of its history was a tribal culture, and like the Jews they were Jews, and then they were Gentiles, and Gentile means everybody else, with no distinction made between them. Most of the Indian tribes, not all, by any means, but most of the Indian tribes in America boiled down to be some form of the word the people, which made everybody not in the tribe the non-people or the other people, or they're kind of written off. So the tendency to do that is widespread, is universal. And what happened with us in our time is that as exploration and colonialism increased the contact with other races, the races were similarly categorized. And not surprisingly, since Northern Europeans were doing the exploring and the colonizing, they put themselves, we put ourselves at the top and put that gradation, and the darker shades of skin were at the bottom of that chain, and the whiter shades were at the top of that chain. And that's an operable truth to this day. Now, that might have been okay if it only measured personal preference. I'm really more comfortable with people who look like me than people who don't look like me. That's okay. But, of course, we didn't stop there. And that leads to the next concept, which is the next slide, which is providentialism. Now, you get two snob words to carry when you go home. So this is a particular Advent bonus here in this class. Providentialism means it's decreed by God. That's providence, an act of providence. Providentialism means that it's decreed by God. So in the social structures, we got, this is the divine right of kings. God made them the king. God did that. The divine right of kings. Tribal cultures, we are the chosen people. The Old Testament is full of chosen people language. We are chosen, everybody else is not chosen. The other tribes are cannon fodder for what God wants to do with us. And that notion of God ordered this appeals to our idea of the timelessness of what we believe and what we hold. And so you end up with the idea that God decreed the social structures. Okay, that God decreed that we had upper class and we had lower class, we had rich people, we had poor people, and that God decreed that. God, providence did that, the placement on a hierarchical scale. And we applied it to all those categories by which we understand people: race, poverty, social status, gender, abilities, and all the other kind of stuff. And much of life ran on that assumption for centuries. For centuries we did that. We've done that for centuries. The 1928 prayer book, right? Many of us here remember the 1928 prayer book, the prayer book that preceded the one we use right now. In the catechism of that, in the back, where you have a question and answer kind of format for teaching the faith, and in a development on the thing that you should love your neighbor, it says, well, one of the questions is, well, what is my duty towards my neighbor? It's 1928 prayer book. It was operable for us as a church until 1979, okay? But part of our obligation toward my duty towards my neighbor, and this is, quote, to submit myself to all my governors, teachers, spiritual pastors, and masters, to order myself lowly and reverently to all my betters, not to covet nor desire other men's goods, but to learn and labor truly to get mine own living, and to do my duty in that state of life unto which it shall please God to call me. 1928 prayer book, strata, providentialism. Okay, you're down, you're supposed to stay down. You're middle, you ought to stay middle. You know, it's a hierarchical, frozen kind of a thing. Now, that's operable truth in our story. That's gone on, and I think a lot of us can probably think of our own examples about that. Then you get a man who comes on the scene in the early part of the 20th century, and his name is Franz Boas. Franz Boas. And he was born in 1858, and died in 1942. And he is the father of modern anthropology. And he had a whole craft of people who followed him in his studies and in his work. The most famous and best known is Margaret Mead, who was part of this group. And they went out and they began to look at other cultures and all the things that anthropologists are supposed to do, and came back with a clear decision and scientifically pointed out that race, they were studying race, that race is a social construct and not a genetic one. Okay? That it was the way we operated in our minds, but it was not part of the created order. A man named Charles King wrote in a book called Gods of the Upper Air, which is about Boas and all of his work, said this, that what they discovered was that, the quote, courtesy, modesty, good manners, and conformity to definite ethical standards are universal. But what constitutes courtesy, modesty, good manners, and ethical standards is not universal. So what we were looking at is people who were structured the same way. They had manners, they wanted to behave, they were doing the right thing. And what we had was a massive difference as to what the right thing might be, or what good manners might be, or whatever. So the point is, it's not built in. It is a part of our structure of life, but it's not providence. It's not built in. So the category, in other words, the categories that we use to identify people in our minds is a matter of necessity. You have to do that. You have to talk about race and gender and all that other sort of a thing. But they're just that. They are categories in our minds. That's all. They are the way we think. They're the way we understand. They are not states of life, to quote the prayer book, into which it hath pleased God to call us. Okay, and that's an important distinction. So our categories of recognition, classification, and judgment about race, poverty, social status, gender abilities, and so forth, are nothing more than really the myths that we have created in our own minds. Now, I'm going to move to another person. Amos Elon. Amos Elon was an Israeli author and scholar, and he wrote a book called on the history of Jerusalem, called Jerusalem, City of Mirrors. And in there, he made this statement about Jerusalem, which I think is true in other places. He said, a myth may not be a fact, but the fact of a myth is a great fact indeed. Okay? A myth may not be a fact, but the fact of a myth is a great fact indeed. We might look askance at some of the political information that other people in this world get. And we think, well, that's not right. That's wrong. That's fake news is the current term for it. So that's not true. Okay, that's one thing. But the fact that all these people believe it is a fact that stands on its own. That's what Elon is talking about. So a myth, and the myth of these providential establishment of structural hierarchies and whatnot, might be a myth, but the fact that we believe it, that we operate under it, is a great fact indeed. Now, that is how the myth of status gets translated into the reality of privilege. That we begin, because we believe it, it's not true, but we think we made it up in our own minds in order to understand people, and then assigned it a value, and then assume that it was God that gave him the value, because we think that God and I agree about everything. And so that God gave him the value, that's providentialism, and that's not true. It's not true. The fact is that God created all people in God's image. And that image may vary from place to place, but we are all in God's image. So it is not true that God assigned people to their standing in our social structures. All are in the image of God. But the fact that we believe, or so many people believe it and act on it, is a significant fact in the disparities within our social structures. Now, we didn't invent that. Okay, I didn't think that up, and you didn't think that up. You didn't bring that into being. I didn't bring that into being. We were born into it, and we assumed it. It sort of came with the, like we used to say back home, it's like the fleas that come with the dog, that you're going to have the dog there. There it is right there. When I grew up, which is in the 40s and the 50s, in those formative years, where I grew up in West Virginia, segregation was nowhere taught, but everywhere believed. You couldn't find anybody who was running around saying that segregation was the way things ought to be, but everybody thought it was the way things ought to be until things changed. But it was there, and we didn't make it. So that brings us to the third section of our title: how do we live as citizens of the kingdom of God in that reality? In a world that has bought into the myth that God has structured society this way, and that's not true, but we operate as if it's true. How do we then behave in that reality? You didn't create it, I didn't create it, but it operates as a fact disguised as providence. So how do we do it? Well, talk about Jesus. What did Jesus do about it? Because he lived in that world. He was born into that world. We're going to talk about Jesus being born here in a little bit and be very excited about that. But the world he was born into was just like the world you and I were born into, where there were stratified assumptions about who people were and where they were and all that sort of thing. As a matter of fact, in first century Judaism, the structure, before God of being that sin and sinful and who's in God's favor and who's out of God's favor was practically a blood sport, because they spent so much time worrying about it. So he was born into that, just like you and I were born into that. So how did he do it? Well, he ignored it. He ignored it. He knew perfectly well that there were categories of people, that there were good people and there were Samaritans. The idea of having a good Samaritan was an oxymoron. So, so Jesus, to the horror of the respected and the people who bought into the system around them, treated women, sinners, Samaritans, lepers, Roman soldiers, and crooked tax collectors the same as he treated Sadducees, Pharisees, Roman governors, puppet kings, and community role models. He ignored the thing. That's what Jesus did about it. So he knew the categories as well as anybody, and he ignored them. So if we're going to talk about living as followers of Christ in this world that works this way, the first lesson is ignore it. Don't treat people differently in accordance with those mythical ideas of social structure. Then secondly, we look closely and critically at the fact of human privilege. Human privilege. Now, there's privilege all around us. For us as a nation, we're 4% of the world's population, and we have our hands in one way or another on 25% of the world's wealth. Now, that's sort of privileged, wouldn't you agree? The math is not too tough, but that's a certain set of privilege to be here in this particular setting. And so then there are other variables like race, gender, sexuality, ability, class, all those things. And I have to say for myself, all of those things are basically tilted in my favor. And you can own it or not, but I'll say for me, they are tilted in my favor. And so I wouldn't trade seats with anybody on this bus. This system, this stuff works for me. I'm okay. I'm all right. It tilts my favor. Now, Jesus took no role in confronting the systems and the social structures of his day. He simply ignored them, but that doesn't let us off the hook, because he also made the statement that those to whom much is given, much is required. Those to whom much is given, much is required. And I've been given a lot. I've been given a lot by a system that I did not create, by virtue of, all kinds of those race, gender, all that other kind of stuff. So the fact is that our privilege in this world, based on myths, though they may be, are still part of our reality, a la Amos Elon. And you and I are called to be stewards of our resources, and privilege is a resource. Privilege is a resource. Now, I know that Christ Church, like everybody else, is going around with the stewardship campaign and, fill out the pledge card and all that sort of stuff. We're doing that at my church, we're doing it at your church. I know that's what's going on. And so the word steward and stewardship is being bandied around quite a bit. And a couple of things to know about stewarding, being a steward, is, first of all, stewards are managers. Managers are not owners. So the first assumption behind the concept of stewardship, whether you're talking about you're filling out your pledge card, or as we're going to be talking about what we do with the privileges that come our way, we need to know that we manage those resources in the interests of the owner. We are not the owners, and that's an important part of it. We are to manage our assets, our resources, our money, pledge cards, but also our privileges, our status, our money, our education, to serve the interests of the owner. Now, I doubt that I'm going to blow anybody away when I tell you that the owner is God. The owner is God. And the interests of the owner that we are to serve with this stewardship have been made clear in a variety of places. I'm going to pull out just two, and that's in the baptismal covenant. And I'm going to apply this to our stewarding of privilege, which is what we're talking about here. One, we promise that we will seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself. Another, that we will strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. Note the verbs. It is not enough in this concept of stewardship to simply do no harm. I am not a person who's out there, blowing up black churches or, behaving badly. It's not enough to avoid behaving badly. The words here, the active words, are seek and strive. So it's not enough to say, well, I never shot anybody. Well, I didn't, but that doesn't cut it. So there's more to it than that. It is not passive, it is active. So for that reason, the disparity in social structures of this world becomes part of our responsibility, part of our stewardship. It's the manner in which we treat each other and how we use the systems in which we live on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, all those categories that we talked about before. Our privilege, hold this on myself, I am a privileged person, and my privilege gives me power. The psychologist Rollo May defines power as the ability to cause or prevent change. All right? I have some power about that. It's not ultimate power. I don't run the world. But, I have power. I wish I had power to heal my friend Tiffany over here, but I don't. The Christian faith, power, the Christian faith gives us responsibility for using that power to serve the interests of God. That's how we are stewards of privilege. Now, how we do that, how you actually do that in the places where we live, is fodder for another forum, or a forum series, or even a way of life, or for that matter, a reason to even have a church like Christ Church. But for this forum, for this point, the thing that I'm trying to say is that social categories are a necessity. We have to have them. We have to have them. We need them in order to function. But assigning them value is natural, but it's above our station and grade. It is not ours to do. Claiming that those assigned values as God's decree is sinful. Living in that reality, according to the kingdom of God, calls upon us first to ignore the social categories as Jesus did, and secondly, to use our status to serve the interests of God, which is the essence of stewardship. Okay? And here comes Tim Cole. Okay. All right. Now, that's what I wanted to tell you about this we go back to the first one there. First one right there. So that's what I wanted to say to you. So let's talk about what questions that raises, or if there anything you want to talk about that, or not, or whatever. Yeah, Tiffany.
Thank you. I wish we could take each of your points and unpack them into individual form. One of the things I really appreciate is your setting Jesus' life and ministry and teachings in the context of pretty extreme social disparity.
Absolutely.
And I wonder, could you unpack for us a little bit more about what you notice about him, beyond simply the fact that he
Ignored him.
The way he navigated those things. We had Kathy Stout in here, and she's been sort of injecting Dietrich Bonhoeffer as a case study throughout our series this year. And sort of this idea of ignoring something on one hand, but what do we mean by ignoring? Is ignoring just participating with it, or is ignoring subverting it, but in a different way?
Well, I think that's a good question. How do you ignore it? And I think the first thing about, there is a difference between ignoring it and being ignorant of it. It's not about not knowing. It's about knowing full well and saying, I choose to operate on a different level, consciously choosing to operate on a different level. The expectation here is that men don't talk to women. That was part of the structure of Jesus' time, that men don't talk to women. Now, Jesus knew that. He said, no, wait a minute. No, I want to talk to I'm going to talk to this woman because we think of it, the Samaritan woman at the well. I'm going to talk to her because there's a lot going on in this person's life. I want to address that. So it's knowing and choosing to operate on a different basis. So that you don't want to. I don't want to tie ignoring and ignorant together. It's not about being stupid about the world in which we live. It's about choosing to operate on a different level, and that's what Jesus actively did. He chose to operate on a different level, and in Jesus' time, the idea, that, for example, you remember the story he told about the tax collector and the Pharisees who were praying in church. And the Pharisee says, I'm really doing a good job here. I tithe and I go to church and I sing in the choir and I do all these good things. And I'm really a good guy. I'm really glad I'm not like that guy over there. And the tax collector over there is feeling bad. I'm feeling bad about. I'm humble before God, and I rely on God's mercy in my life, and that's how I live. And Jesus says, it's the tax collector who got it right. Okay, now that's knowing full well that the structure that he was in said, the Pharisees got it right, and the tax collector, nobody liked tax collectors, because basically tax collecting was a scam, that you bought the right to collect taxes and then got whatever you could out of the people. That was the way it worked. So they were not universally admired in the community. So Jesus said, this guy got it right before God. He knows what he's talking about, and he sets that up that way. So does that speak to what? Okay. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, so you framed your talk in a way to an audience that you see as privileged. If you were giving the talk to an audience that you saw as less privileged, not privileged, would you give the same talk, or if not, how would you change it?
That's a good question. Moving on, we should go. That's a good question. I think I know the people of Christ Church, Georgetown, because I am one of the people of Christ Church, Georgetown. This is my world, so I'm talking to people in my world. I think that's where I am right now. And if I were someplace else, I would have to earn the right to speak to that group of people somehow. I'd have to establish the fact that I have a right to speak this way, because somebody who is suffering, not the beneficiary of these structures, but somebody who understands themselves to be suffering under those, they're not going to think I have any idea what they're talking about, what their world is. So I would have to, one difference would be I would have to establish my credentials, how do I have the right to say this? That's true, in an academic setting, you do that by quoting other scholars. In another place, I'd have to quote somebody. I'd have to get some voice to verify what I'm trying to say in that setting. I haven't done that, so I didn't think about that, so I don't know. Does that speak to? That would be the first thing I would have to do. I think the points would be the same, but I'd have to come at them in a quite different way. Because here, I think that you experience the world the way I experience the world, and we experience the world, and so I don't think we have to worry much about that here for us. I would if it were a different congregation. Does that speak to what you know? Yes, sir.
So, our church, like many others, organizations, is quite separate. We are all white here. We're all good in fair income, and we don't have much.
How do you know we're all white?
What?
How do you know we're all white?
Does anyone want to say they're black?
But I mean, maybe you're not all white.
That's another category of thought, but we'll come over to that and just move to that one. Go ahead, sir, and finish your question. But we'll come to that in just a minute. That's another part of it. But that's a good point. We'll get to it. Okay, go ahead.
Our churches really ought to be involved in helping churches where they're not so well off.
Yep.
And now this church today is considering that. We are going to meet with a church, Ward 6, or where is it, Ward
8, maybe.
in the black area.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we did talk with them to find out whether or not working together we can improve our lives and particularly their lives. In other words, the church doesn't have to be a central organization, it has to be citywide.
Right.
And it has to help others, because it's the whole point of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're beginning to think about, and I think we should carry on.
Absolutely. I think it's exactly the right thing to do, and to reach out. The one piece that I would put on it is that would be the chance of that really making a difference in the kingdom of God is when the benefit is understood to be mutual. To be mutual. That whatever they've crafted in that, I don't know what church you're talking about, obviously, but whatever they're about can enrich you all, as well as vice versa. Right, so I think that approaching it with a mutual, excuse me, expectation has far more promise than here am I, Father Bountiful, and that's an easy attitude to pick up, but it would not bode well for the thing. So I think it's great. Good for you. Good for you. And quickly on the other question, the categories that we have are not, are not clear. Are not clear. They're people here. At what point? It used to be when I was growing up, you had an octoroon and all that kind of stuff about how much black blood you might have in you and all that other kind of stuff. But it's also true that sexuality is on a spectrum. That there's some hardwired, to be gay, hardwired to be heterosexual. But most of us are somewhere in the middle. I wouldn't have any idea. I mean, I don't want to know, but the other is, I wouldn't know how to judge it. So the categories are not as fixed as we would sometimes pretend. Catherine?
I had something for you, but if I could just ask somewhat in the same vein.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think, to me personally, the term woke is not a persuasive one because of the way it's used in the culture wars. So I would not come in here and ask you to be woke because it's not an innocent word that stands by itself. You know, it's part of the culture wars, and I mean I could wait to hold another class about that. But aware, yes, aware. You know, open to all of those sorts of things. Yeah, are a positive part of that. But I would not, woke would not pass my lips in here. Tom?
If you did a search and replace on your presentation and substituted the word social with economic, how would you change your presentation? What would you
I wouldn't. I think it is social. Social is part of it. Social is an important part of this. I mean, it's, you know, the upper crust and, you know, that sort of thing. What are you talking about when you say social? What do you mean?
No, I'm not talking about race.
Okay.
I'm talking about economic status. So if you were to replace the word right there, social structures with economic structures,
Oh, okay.
would you change your presentation?
Not much, because I think they operate the same way. I've known people with a lot of money, and I've known people with very little money, and I'm not universally committed to the rich. I don't think that having a lot of money assigns us anything more than a lot of responsibility. So I don't think that you can do it. So I wouldn't change it much in that. It seems to me that that's part of the picture. And if you're a person who has a great deal of money, and of course in terms of the entire planet, we have a lot of money. You know, the fact that all of us could point to somebody who has more than I do individually does not change that equation. So we have that, but that is those to whom much is given, much is required. You know, that to me is a measure of responsibility, as opposed to a measure of natural worth that goes with it. There's an article in this morning's paper about somebody, if it's all true, colossally wealthy, who, not to be admired, the person that they told the story about. Mr. Gray has not spoken, so.
Getting back to Margaret's question, would you restructure it as a series of questions, your presentation today, if you were talking to another?
Somebody who would be on the lower end of some social scale. Is that what you're thinking? Is it so that you and I would? And so would I keep? I'm sure I didn't quite get the verb in there. So. Well, yeah.
She asked if you were giving this presentation to another, how would you put it, another group,
Right.
a non-elite
Right.
group, how would you structure it? And so I asked if a way to do it would be to restage it as a series of questions.
You could do that, yes, ma'am. I think that, that when in a place like this, the questions that one raises need to be universal questions to which everyone is accountable. So that would be an important qualification of it. But yes, that would be a way to do it. Boyden, you had a.
Well, in respect to your observation, you have credentialed yourself to speak to a different class, if you will. I'm surprised to hear Mike, not surprised to hear Mike approaching black churches, but he's a pioneer in what is the most important cause of disparity, which is black education. And he's a pioneer in book charter schools, and
Mm-hmm.
I did a lot of school choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a lot of the women who did a
Yep.
lot before, who was a black organizer.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually involved myself with these black parents and grandparents and caretakers, and
Great.
it was one of the most rewarding things in my life. And I think that's something
Right.
we are patients of the Bishop Walker School.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should treat that the same as
I, I mean, I think you're exactly right. And the commitment of Christ Church to the Bishop Walker School is exemplary in the way y'all done that. I think that choosing a place to go, are you all familiar with the Custer advantage in terms of problem solving? Well, this is something you really ought to know. And the Custer advantage is when you're completely surrounded, you don't have to aim very much. And so that's so there are lots of targets. I mean, education is one, economic, I mean, there are all kinds of places to go. So there are plenty of I mean, one would not say, well, gee, okay, I really understand this. I can't imagine what to do. Well, come on. I mean, they're all around everywhere. And education is certainly one. And it's an area that I think that this community, individually and corporately, is well prepared to address. I think it's great. It's good. Yes, definitely.
I'm sensing, well, maybe I'm just sensing it in myself. But when we talk about privilege, as people who are privileged, one of the first things that come up is a deep sense of, oh my goodness, I don't want to be the rich young fool. I don't want to be the rich fool who said, eat, drink, be merry.
Yeah. Tomorrow we die. Right.
Lazarus is out,
Right.
you know,
Yeah. Right.
at my gate.
Right.
None of us want to be that. And that drives us to giving and generosity and things like that. But I think one of the questions maybe we don't say out loud is, how much is enough? When am I not that? And when am I actually, we all know we're not Mother Teresa.
Right.
Because we still live in the houses we live
Right.
in and wear the clothes we
Right.
haven't given
Right.
everything away to the poor. We're somewhere in between those two. And I think all of us live with a sense of, am I justified?
Right.
And I kind of hear the parable of, not the parable, but Jesus' observation of the widow.
Putting
In her
right.
mite, and then his commentary to those who have more.
Right.
And I guess my question to you is there some diagnostic question that you would offer us that we can even take, not to absolve our consciences, but to examine our consciences and ask, Lord, are we clean before you while still being privileged?
Well, I think you talk about not wanting to be the rich fool, and for most of us, the only part we can really work on is fool. We don't have to be fools.
Right.
We are probably not going to satisfy anything by becoming poor ourselves. I mean, that was St. Francis of Assisi, but whatever. But that's not what we're going to do. And I think that that in terms of, I think there are two things that come to mind. One is that in any major endeavor in life, and stewarding privilege is a major effort in life, that a major effort in life, in any major effort in life, a good question is more powerful than a good answer. That if one is constantly asking, can I do more? How can I serve more? How can I make more of a difference in this situation, whatever, that's going to work out very well. The person who says, I tithe 10% and decide that that's after taxes and all the other kind of cribbing that we do, that's not a bad answer, but it's a killer. It kills the enterprise. The enterprise lives on the good question. So I think that having the question is probably a primary motivation. I had another thought and I can't remember, it left me. So that's what you get for bringing old people in here but I can't remember the other point. But anyway, that's one. I think having a question is a very powerful part of it. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
The definition of the issue is very important to what you're talking about, because all of the help of the people is different categories. And you have to determine what is the definition of helping other people. Otherwise, you never get anywhere with any of these issues.
Right.
And it seems to me that our argument, I'm concerned about it, how are we going to create a privilege.
Right.
And how do you allow the discussion so privilege is meaningful to that discussion? And how do you have the wisdom and common sense not to ask that question? And look at that state of the inquiry. That state of inquiry, which trying to create a climate of doing good things for other people.
Right.
Start taking it forward,
Mm-hmm.
the whole thing changes. And so the importance of leadership when you're talking about these kinds of issues, to keep people organized and focused and on a track that makes some kind of sense, and to enable the discussion to go over, as opposed to chasing a rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm. Right.